And now for this afternoon's talk. It's a distinct pleasure to introduce to you our friend Stephen Esteban Bartlett. I'm going to be talking to you today about the crisis of child immigrants from Central America, that impact on America, and especially that impact on the children, what that means. Stephen is coordinator of education and advocacy for agricultural ministry, and as you came in the door, you may have seen there's a stack of calendars. If you didn't pick one up as you're going out the door today. Stephen is also the director of Sustainable Agriculture of Louisville. Stephen. Hello, everyone. It's a very great pleasure to be here and among a group such as yourselves who are concerned about social justice, economic justice in the world, and peacemaking. And I think these are all related, as probably you all understand as well. I'm going to ask some questions during my talk, so I would like this to be a bit participatory, if you can be, because I know that a lot of the knowledge that we're going to share today is shared by many of you, and it's not just from me only. So I know you're eating, but don't be shy about responding if you ask a question. Today's topic is kind of out of the news already a little bit. Child, you can't hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, speak right into the microphone.
Okay. The child migrant crisis is not as much in the news these days as it was 2 or 3 months ago, but the situation that brought it about has not changed, and the deportations continue, and the detentions of children and families continue. Does anyone recall from the mainstream media what the number of children and families who were being detained during this crisis? What the number of those people were at a given time? Anyone know?
60,000? 60,000?
Yes, that's close. About 68,000 people at one point were being detained. These are all families and children, unaccompanied children who had arrived. And from which countries? You probably know.
Honduras.
Honduras,
El Salvador.
Guatemala, and El Salvador. Those 3 countries. It's kind of interesting to think about why it was those 3 countries and not other countries, such as Nicaragua, for example, which is right in the same region. Today I'm going to focus on Honduras, and maybe we can talk a little bit about Guatemala and El Salvador as well. But Honduras is the place I've been traveling to, and we related to partners most closely. And in Honduras, we first heard about this child migratory phenomenon from our partners who are from the Garifuna community. The Garifuna are Afro-Indigenous peoples who live on the northern coast of Honduras, actually all the way to Belize and Guatemala. But the large majority of them live on about 40 communities on the northern coast of Honduras. They are Africans who linked up with Carib and Taino people. They speak native indigenous languages, and they've lived in the communities along the coast there for the last 220 years. And they told us about a year and a half ago at a meeting we had here in Georgia that many of the young people were just disappearing. They were just vanishing from the communities. And they said, this is something new for us. We haven't seen this kind of phenomenon before, where children who are unaccompanied by parents were just leaving for the United States. So I'd like to talk a little bit about what their particular situation, and also the situation in general in Honduras. Honduras is where about 80% of all these children and young parents with children have been coming from, with Guatemala being number 2 and El Salvador number 3 in terms of numbers. But Honduras has a particular case, and so the factors that in my view, are the reason why so many are coming from Honduras have to do with the history of U.S. intervention in Honduras, have to do with the history of the fight against the Nicaraguan Revolution, when the Sandinistas were being attacked from Honduras with U.S. bases, funding Contras, etc. At that time, it wasn't just the intervention in terms of funding the Contras, but it was the repression of social movements during that period in Honduras. Our partners who are indigenous people from the Garifuna and from Malenca and from Maya Chorti, from Pech and Tolpan indigenous peoples, they all have informed me that at that time they were severely repressed in that period. That was when John Negroponte was the ambassador there, and the CIA was involved in undermining those social movements at that time. So why do I bring that up? Well, because that created a climate in which U.S. corporations could have free reign. And of course, Honduras is famous for being the first country called a blank republic. What do we call it? Banana republic, right? Yeah. At that time, United Fruit, penetrated, took over a lot of control of most of the good land of Honduras, and planted bananas for consumption in the United States. Crushed labor disputes. There were terrible massacres that took place, et cetera, et cetera. So Honduras was a banana republic, and now today it's becoming an African palm republic. African palm is the plant that's being grown across Honduras. It's a very wonderful tree that's kind of been hijacked and kidnapped in a way from Africa. In Africa, the African palm is used for all kinds of purposes. It's used to make cooking oil for families. It's used to make a wine, kind of wine that's, they say, from God to man, because all you have to do is put a tap in the tree, and by the afternoon, enough fermentation has taken place that you have a nice palm wine. They say from God to man, you just need a guy who can climb up the tree to get it. And I've been at various ceremonies in Sierra Leone where we drank the palm wine. But this tree now is being used mainly for its oil-bearing seeds. It's a huge tree. It grows up very tall and wide. You can see across the Honduran landscape. As you drive from Progreso all the way east, you can drive literally for 6 hours, and all you see are rows and rows of African palm trees in perfect lines. And they, after they are producing for about 8 or 10 or 12 years, they grow up to about 30, 40 feet. Their production goes down, and then they hit them they girdle them, and they put poison on them and kill them. And immediately they plant more African palm trees in between them. So it's a non-stop plantation monoculture that has been taken over a lot of countries in the tropics, not only Honduras, but Honduras is the #1 now country in the Americas for African palm production. And who owns the African palm industry? Just a handful of individuals. The #1 largest landholder of Honduras is named Miguel Facuse. I just saw he was listed as the 11th most wealthy person in Central America, out of all the billionaires that are coming up in the region, Mexico and the region. Anyway, Miguel Facuse, he owns the refineries that process the African palm, and he has at his disposal more than 500 so-called security forces, but who are actually kind of his own paramilitary force. And they reside in his lands that he has. A lot of the lands that he has taken over have been taken over illegally. And so the Garifuna people I've worked with, I first learned about Miguel Facuse back in 2002, when we were looking at land that the Garifuna had title to, but which had been invaded by Miguel Facuse and other large landowners who had come into their land and planted African palm. That was back in 2002. Today, the number of African palm trees across Honduras is just geometrically expanded. They have just, you can see 20-acre fields where just devoted to the seedlings of these trees. And so this is taking land that was the prime land of Honduras, taken away from farmers, indigenous peoples, and put it in the hands of very few powerful landowners. The people who actually do the hard labor are very much exploited. It's a very low-paying, very grueling job to harvest the palm and bring it to the carts and then to haul it off to the refinery. And these people, when they protest, and there are land conflicts all across Honduras, 20 or 30 different groups in very strong land disputes across Honduras. So the case of the Garifuna, they're trying to hold on to their land, and I could go into a lot of detail about their campaign, but they have recovered recently, since the last 2 years, a beautiful piece of land. That very piece of land where I first heard the name Miguel Jose. And it's 2,500 acres. They're creating a cultural center and an agricultural training center in that land. And our organization has been supporting their efforts to recover the land, and despite the presence of paramilitaries who are threatening them, etc., they have settled this land. They want to consolidate their land holdings there. Their communities are fragile because most of the Garifuna communities are on the coast, where tourism interests, tourism corporations have moved in and have been using hardball tactics to push people off the beach properties. They live on the coast because they were fisher folk and farmers, and they had to be near the ocean for the past 2.5 centuries. And the men are the fisher folk, and the women do the farming. And the women produce a wonderful cassava bread, and it's a very wonderful economy that they have in that environment. So they rely on living on the coastal lands with good fishing and with access to land for growing of their staple crops like cassava, bananas, plantains, etc. A lot of the Garifuna over the years have migrated to the United States and to other countries, mostly in New Orleans, Upper West Side of Bronx, New York City, and a couple other spots. And so they have families. Many of them, like many Central Americans, have families in the United States, like many Mexicans, etc., who they rely on to send them remittances because the economy is so poor, there's so little economic opportunity. Why? Because we have free trade agreements that have taken over the whole region, right? You have the Central America Free Trade Agreement. Dominican Republic, Central America signed a free trade agreement modeled on the NAFTA, which gave extraordinary power to corporations, to investors who can sue governments if they try to put in place any kind of environmental or labor standards. Those can be challenged in NAFTA courts, etc. So you have Central America trade agreement that opened up the floodgates to no tariffs on U.S. exports of corn, soybeans, and all kinds of products. As Felix and I were discussing earlier, Mexico now allows foreign corporations to own land. This was part of NAFTA, to do away with the collective land ownership. So it's a common trend to privatize, to take away the rights of people as common land rights, etc. And that's happening throughout the region. So the Garifuna are not the ones directly impacted by the worst violence because in their communities they have very little violence. They are kind of autonomous communities. They have their own radio stations. They speak their own language. They produce their own music. They're very culturally active. They have their own ceremonies, their own religion. But what you have is, what happened was about a few months ago, but the people who live in places like San Pedro Sula, have any of you ever flown into San Pedro Sula? They warn you, it's very dangerous. Don't just go to the downtown city and walk around. It's too dangerous. And in fact, it's one of the most dangerous cities in Central America. Why? Because the gangs have become very active, and the police have made a war against the gangs there. So it's like a free fire zone, almost. The police, with utter impunity, have killed many, many young people. The gangs, many of them were founded there because they were in gangs in the United States, and they were deported back to Central America. And then those gangs then became international. Right? That's how they became international. And the U.S., in its war against drugs, etc., just fomented this. Now, what happened in 2009 in Honduras? The terrible thing that happened in 2009 in Honduras. The coup, yes, the coup. The coup brought into power a group of people, the highest, most wealthy people of Honduras. And what they did was dismantle all the beginnings of democratic process in Honduras. They dismantled the agrarian reform negotiations that were going on, the land reform negotiations. They took away they corrupted the judicial and the military and the army to do their bidding against people who were fighting for their lands. So, and they themselves, as the wealthiest people of Honduras, were tied to narco traffickers. We're tied to human trafficking. We're tied to the worst elements that bring in money. These are very ruthless people. It's estimated that out of the Congress of Honduras, probably half of them directly are involved in narco trafficking, and the other half probably finance themselves through narco trafficking donations. The police of Honduras, they say 75%, according to a Honduran official, said are beyond recovery because they're so corrupt. They would have to be removed completely. The corruption, they are just doing the bidding of the highest payer. They become privatized security forces. So in that